This episode of Capes and Lunatic Sidekicks is brought to you by Tweaked Audio. To get awesome headphones, go to tweakedaudio.com and use the coupon code Southgate to get 30% off, free shipping, and a lifetime warranty. Or you can get there through the link on our website, southgatemediagroup.com. Little couldn't make it this week, but that's all right. I have a very special guest, legendary writer, Mr. J.M. DeMatteis. Thank you for joining me.
It is my pleasure.
We're here because, well, we usually talk Spider-Man here, so I wanted to ask you. First of all, just your work has meant so much to me, especially the Spider-Man stuff.
Thank you.
Just as a young man, spent a lot of time on my own, just like your writing and a lot of some of the other great writers like Mark Grunwald and like a lot of the people in the Marvel and DC side. It just, I don't know, just spoke to me, and it's made life better.
That's a very sweet thing. Thank you for saying that.
Before we jump into Kraven's Last Hunt, did you want to talk about your current stuff now?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I appreciate that 30 years later, people still want to talk about Kraven's Last Hunt. It's really kind of astonishing to me, and I'm very grateful. But I've had a career that has continued for many years after that. So I always like to make sure folks know what I'm doing now. So I'll just run through a few things, and then we can jump into Kraven. Okay. First thing is just recently released from Berger Books at Dark Horse is the collected edition of The Girl in the Bay. Karen Berger, who ran Vertigo, now has her own imprint at Dark Horse, Berger Books, and this is a series that I did for her that I'm very proud of. In fact, Barnes & Noble and Amazon both picked it as one of their fall picks, so we're very excited about that. It's sort of a twisty, supernatural time travel tale about the search for identity, and a really, really cool story. And IDW just collected another recent series of mine called Impossible Incorporated, which is an all-ages cosmic adventure in sort of the Fantastic Four meets Doctor Who in a weird way, that I did with my buddy Mike Cavallero, who I've worked on many projects with over the years. And I got a lot of animation coming up in the next year. I've got episodes of Marvel's animated Spider-Man. One should be on in a few weeks, I think. Other one on in the spring. 2 DC animated movies, new ones that I've done a bunch of them. 2 new ones coming up in 2020 that I can't talk about yet. The next thing that I can talk about is I did a short with Neil Gaiman's Death character, and that will be on the Wonder Woman Bloodlines DVD that comes out in October. And so a lot of animation work, a lot of comic book work, and those are the ones I can talk about right now. I've got a couple other comic book projects in the hopper that I can't talk about just yet. So always busy, always creative, and the last thing I do have to mention, anyone who's interested, who's an aspiring writer, I do a writing workshop. I do it maybe once every couple of years in New York. It's called Imagination 101. It's a full weekend where we talk about writing for comics and animation and just writing in general, the creative process in general, both the practical side of being a writer and sort of the metaphysics of story. And it's from Friday to Sunday. It's November 8th through 10th. And if you're interested, you can go to my website, jmdmateis.com, and go to the workshop section. And now I'm done hyping all the new stuff, and we can talk about whatever you want.
I was going to say, so you're not busy at all. Okay.
No, not in the least. Not in the least.
I mean, if you want to hit that up at the end of the episode too, that's fine. But okay. But like your writing classes and stuff. like the syllabus, is it just filled full of your works, or?
No. I mean, I don't just focus on my stuff. No, we really talk about the whole process, the whole creative process. Like I said, the nuts and bolts of being a writer in the day-to-day reality of that. And then what I love is just the whole idea of story and where it comes from and how we build it and how we engage with characters in a more metaphysical way, because story to me is like, I always feel like the stories are out there in another dimension. They're floating around. They already exist, and they pick individuals like, that's the guy I want to tell my story. But it's like when the work is really working, I feel like I'm not creating the story. The story is just coming through me, and that's when I know writing is at its absolute best. When I feel like I'm really slaving over it, and I have the hammer and chisel, and I'm like really sweating and slaving. That's not the moments I look for. The moments I look for is when I wake up in the morning with a movie playing in my head, and I say, oh my God, what is that? I've never seen that before, and I have to rush to the computer to get the idea down because it just keeps pouring through from what really feels like another dimensional space. But we talk about that, and we talk about the realities of freelance life and the struggles and what you have to know, and working with editors and all kinds of interesting things. And again, I keep the class small. I never like to have more than 10 people in the class, so it's a whole weekend. We're all together in a conference room, and it's really intimate. And by the time the weekend's over, I end up learning as much from my students as they learn from me. It's a great experience for me, and I hope for them as well.
All right. Like I said, yeah, at the end of the episode, you definitely have to promote that again. I mean, that sounds wonderful.
Thanks. All right. So what do you want to know?
All right. Well, I tried to do some homework, but a lot of this was the internet. So you can verify for me because we know the internet never lies.
Maybe I'll just make up a whole new version of how Kraven's Last Night.
There you go. So is this, well, I was reading, is this true that like you came up with, I guess, the idea of the story first, and it wasn't even a Spider-Man story at first?
It went through many incarnations before. So this goes back to what I was just talking about before, the metaphysics of story. I really feel that stories are alive, and they're like growing, evolving entities. And this story had a mind and a life of its own, and I thought I was in control of it. As you'll see, as I tell you, it knew exactly where it needed to end up, and I had no clue. The original idea, believe it or not, was for a Wonder Man miniseries. You remember Wonder Man from the Avengers?
Oh yeah.
And there had once been a story where I guess he died and he came back to life, and I thought, well, what would it be like for someone to really to be buried? And then I think my original version was he was buried for 6 months. He was killed by his brother, the Grim Reaper, and to come up out of the grave 6 months later and realize you've been robbed of 6 months of your life, and the dynamic between the two brothers. So it was a cool idea. But let's face it, if I had done a Wonder Man miniseries back in whatever it was, 1985, or whenever I first came up with the idea, we wouldn't be having this conversation today. We just wouldn't, And so I pitched it to Tom DeFalco at Marvel, and thank God, he said no. For whatever reason, it didn't excite him. Maybe because it was Wonder Man. I don't know what it was. But part of me feels like it was the story going, no, it's not time yet. So I let that story sort of gestate, and I always feel like stories sort of brew in the back of my head. And I came up with what I thought was a really great idea for a Batman graphic novel. And the premise was that the Joker kills Batman, and the Joker, having achieved his goal, his mind snaps and he goes sane, buries Batman alive. Eventually Batman comes back from the grave, and we take it from there. So I pitched that. I forget who, it might have been first to Denny O'Neil. And what I recall it was Len Wein, because Len Wein was editing The Killing Joke at the time. He said, well, and what I was doing in my Joker story was getting into some backstory on Joker, what happens to him after he goes sane, what kind of life does he live. And Len felt like, they had these two Joker stories going at once, and he didn't think they would work side by side. So I put that away. And maybe 10 years later, I did a story for Legends of the Dark Knight called Batman Going Sane, which is one of my favorite things that I've ever done. So one of the great lessons for writers is never throw your ideas away. Sometimes it takes 5 minutes, sometimes it takes literally 20 years, but they'll always find a home out there somewhere. So I took the germ of that Batman idea, and I saved it and did it later. But this coming back from the grave thing, so now I've been rejected twice. So like another year, I think, went by, and Denny O'Neil was now the Batman editor. And I took the Joker out of the story, put Hugo Strange in, and pitched it to Denny. And this is so long ago that Denny's reply, as I recall, was, we have our Batman graphic novel for the year. They used to do One graphic novel a year. It was a big deal. It was a hardcover. All right, so I put the idea away again. But again, you have to be unrelenting, or should I say this? The idea has to be unrelenting. The idea, the ideas that make it into the world are the ones that never let go. And this concept kept going at me. It wouldn't let go. But so time went by, and now it's, I don't know what it was, maybe late 1986 or early 87. I don't remember exactly when. I know Kraven came out in 87, but I don't remember what point in the year it came out. And I was approached by Marvel and Tom DeFalco again about taking over Spectacular Spider-Man. Okay, that would be fun. And by the way, Mike Zeck is going to draw it. Oh, and Mike and I worked together on Captain America for years, and we had a great time working together. He's one of my favorite artists, and I love him as a human being. He was a great guy to work with. So that was really exciting. And I started thinking about that idea again. What if I take this idea that I had for this Hugo Strange Batman story, create my own new villain to replace Hugo Strange? And all right, so Jim Owsley, who went on to become Christopher Priest, was the Spider-Man editor at the time. So I pitched him this coming back from the grave, Hugo Strange-ish character, this new villain that I got to tell you, I don't have any memory of who the villain was, what I developed for him. It's completely gone. I have no idea. But I had this new villain, and Owsley loved the idea, and he said, "Okay, let's do it." And so I was home one day, and I like to say that these are before the days of the internet. Now, when a writer wants to waste time, we have an infinite ways to waste time on the internet. But back then, we had to find other ways to waste time to avoid writing. So I was sitting in my office one day, and I just picked up a Marvel Universe handbook just as a way to waste time. And I was flipping through the handbook and came across the entry for Kraven the Hunter, a villain I had never given a second thought to. If I was making a list of my favorite Spider-Man villains, he probably wouldn't even be on the list, Mm-hmm. But they mentioned in there somewhere, and to this day I don't know whether it was established in a story or if the person that wrote that entry in the Marvel Universe handbook just made it up to fill out the page. It said that Kraven was Russian. I'm a big fan of Dostoevsky. Is one of my favorite writers in the world. And Crime and Punishment, the Brothers Karamazov, all those great novels, and the way he explores the Russian soul, which is really, to me, the universal soul. And so I read this, and all of a sudden, like in a flash, I understood Kraven. I knew who he was. I saw the whole backstory. And I called up Owsley, and I basically said, forget this new villain. Kraven the Hunter is going to be the villain. But he was like, but I like the new villain. I said, no. It's got to be Kraven. I was like, suddenly just the same thing. It's like this cosmic story was trying to put the pieces together. All right, we need Spider-Man. We need Mike Zeck. We need Kraven the Hunter. And because Mike and I had done Captain America together, we had created a character together, Vermin. And I needed a character to contrast Kraven's version of Spider-Man with Peter's version of Spider-Man. So because we had worked together on Captain America, I pulled Vermin into it. And then the final piece of the puzzle, which was the most painful piece for me, was that at that point when I was writing Kraven's Last Hunt, it was a really rough time for me in my life. I was going through some really, really hard things in my personal life, which was awful for me, but great for the story. Because all the pain that you see in the story, all that struggle that you see in the story, Peter crawling back from the grave was really sort of a metaphor what I was going through in my life, In fact, all of those characters in some way or other, I didn't realize at the time, was some reflection of some aspect of my psyche and the struggle I was going through. So all these elements came together at the exact right moment in time. All those rejections that came before had to be, because it had to come at that moment in time. I think if I had done the same exact story 6 months before or 6 months after, again, we might not be talking about it today, because it was like a perfect storm, and the final element was just the sheer misery I was going through in my own life at the time, which happily did not last. So, and again, I'll say the same thing, Mike Zeck. If Mike Zeck hadn't drawn that story, we might not be talking about it today. All the elements, McLeod's inking, even the lettering. We've had a couple of panels in recent years where they got the whole team together for the first time that we were probably ever in a room together. Because as freelancers, you're never in the same place at the same time. And I realized it's, to make a great comic book story, and I'm not, at the time we weren't thinking we were doing anything special, but we're talking about it 30 years later, so we sort of realized, we must have done something special. But for that to happen, you need every element. It's not just, I don't care how great my story is, if you don't have a storyteller and an artist like Mike Zeck, Bob McLeod's inking, the lettering is so important. Rick Parker's lettering, the coloring, every element has to really come together to really make a story work. So as much pride as I take in my part of it, in writing the story, I also know that if all those elements had not been lined up, we wouldn't be having this conversation now.
Oh, I mean, just mentioning you and Mike Zeck's run on Captain America. I mean, I've gone back and read the back issues, and I hold your run up there with like my all-time favorite writer, Mark Grunwald.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Well, Mark was also my editor on Captain America, and a good friend, and what a great guy, and what a great mind he had, and just a wonderful editor to work with. And all these years later, it's still heartbreaking to think of how young he was when he left us.
I mean, that if anyone asked me, if you could talk to anyone with us or not with us anymore, that's like the first name on my list is Mark Grunwald.
Yeah, and you would have had a great conversation. I'll tell you that too.
I'm sure, but I just find that so like amusing that most people say like, oh, what this is like the best Kraven, that Kraven's Last Hunt is the best Kraven story ever, and it's like he was just like a last minute substitution almost.
Yeah, I know. And yet the whole story is his, right? He's the dominant, he's the dominant figure in the story. It's so that's what I mean. It's like, I always say, who's writing this story? I'll take the credit. My name's in the credits, but someone else was like feeding me all this is what it felt like. And it had to be Kraven. It had to work just the way it worked. And it's a process that after all these years of as a professional writer, that still fascinates me, the way that a story comes together and all the little synchronicities and all the little messages from beyond that come together to create the story in just the right way.
So it's like the old cliche is true. It's like, oh, you're not, the characters almost write themselves.
Well, when it's really working, that's exactly right. It's like you're not writing the story's writing you, is the way I like to put it. And the same thing with the characters. Yeah, people talk to the other thing people talk to me a lot about, other than Kraven, is JLI with Giffen. And well, how did you put these characters together, and how did you do this? We didn't. We put these guys started talking to each other, and they led us on. That's what you want. That's what you hope for. You want the characters to come alive on the page, and then you want them to surprise you. If you as the writer, if you're surprised by what's happening in your story, if your story is galloping off into directions that you never expected, then you're onto something good. And that's very much what Kraven was.
And I mean, just the whole, the Kraven's Last Hunt is definitely all about Kraven, but I mean, I think we get a lot of good Peter moments too.
Oh, absolutely. I just mean that Kraven sort of is the dominant force, but in the end, it's a very important story for Peter, because what the story is about in the end is defining who and what Spider-Man is. There's Kraven's warped idea of what Spider-Man is, and then there's Peter and what Spider-Man truly is. And the contrast between the two, in the end, really, really defines Spider-Man.
And did I also see, like, you decided to make it more about Peter and Mary Jane? Because, I mean, this was, like, the first story after the actual marriage, right?
Yeah, and my memory is, I think when I started the story, because we took some time to work on it, because it was, it was a 6-parter. Mm-hmm. And I don't even know if they were married when I first started to work on it. I think Jim Salicrup might have recently reminded me that. And then somewhere along the line in the process, they decided that the marriage was going to happen, which that's another bit of synchronicity that made the story even stronger. Now, if he was, him being in love with Mary Jane and crawling out of the grave to get back to the woman he loves, that's very powerful. But crawling out of the grave to get to the woman that you literally just married, mm-hmm. that adds a whole other layer of emotion and drama to the story. And then the last thing I'll mention about these wonderful synchronicities is the black costume, which was being used then, Mm-hmm. So had we done that story at a time when he wasn't in the black costume, still be a very powerful story, but try to picture that story with him in the red and blue costume, which just feels a little too bright and, dare I say, comic booky for that particular story. The black costume in and of itself captures the whole mood of the story. So all these things, all these threads came together. It's fascinating to me. And I've only realized this in recent years as people like you have asked me about the story and we've had to talk about it, and you go, oh, that's right. I didn't think about that. And these things pop up and you realize all these wonderful threads that came together.
Yeah, because like everything is firing on all cylinders. It seems like because that black suit was perfect for that, like that Mike Zeck image of him, crawling out of the grave and
yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, that's gone on to become like such an iconic image. And I have to say this about Mike as well, and I've said this before, but it bears repeating. Comic books are all about collaboration, and when you're working what's called Marvel style, Marvel style is I write a very detailed plot. Mm-hmm. Then say Mike will take that and he will pencil it. I'll get the pencils, and then I'll script from the pencils. So the finished script doesn't go in until the pencils are done, which means I'm reacting to the artwork. Now, Mike is just a consummate storyteller. You look at a Mike Zeck page, everything is crystal clear. Every movement, the flow from panel to panel. You never have to explain, as sometimes unfortunately you do, you never have to explain what's going on in a panel. You never have to say like, well, I'm leaping off the roof now, because the artist drew it in a way that you can't really tell what he's doing, and you run into that a lot of comics with certain artists. Maybe they haven't been doing it long enough. The storytelling isn't clear enough so that the writing, it has to underscore what's in the visuals. With Mike, you never have to do that. Everything is crystal clear, so you're not explaining things. And the surface emotions are all there. You look at a character's face, you know what that character's feeling. So if you read Kraven's Last Hunt, it's all internal monologue. It's in Peter's head, it's in Kraven's head, it's in Mary Jane's head. And I had the freedom to not just go to the surface level of their thoughts and feelings, but to dig deeper and counter thoughts and deeper and counter thoughts to that. And had Mike not drawn that story, I could have spent half my time explaining what was in the pictures. And I would have had to approach telling that story in a very different way. But because I had Mike and his crystal clear storytelling, that allowed me to go down into these wonderful interior monologues, which I think really illuminated the story and took it to another level.
I think again, Mike's the other component why we're talking about this story 30 years later. Because if you read a story and if the writing's not your cup of tea, or you're like, I don't know about that art, but just when everything, both sides are functioning at 110%, I think that's why the story is so classic.
Yeah, and that's so important for people to remember about comics. I mean, I've had stories where I know I've written a great story. Mm-hmm. But maybe the art doesn't work, or sometimes the art is really excellent and the story's excellent, but there's a chemical click between writer and artist that doesn't happen, mm-hmm. just the way it is with two people. You might meet someone and there's just no click, and you try to have a conversation and you're both sort of just like, you can't think of anything to say, and I've seen that where I've like, hey, that's a good story. Hey, that's pretty good art. How come this comic book feels so flat? So with Mike, they're all, aside from his skill and my skill, there was a kind of a chemical reaction between the two of us. And then, of course, a reaction between McLeod's inking and Mike's penciling, and then the wonderful lettering. And, so like I said, it's in the end, it's all, I can talk about it as much as I want, but in the end, it's all sort of magic to me to this day. And I love the fact that it's still magic to me and kind of mysterious how this stuff happens and why one story works and why another story doesn't. And sometimes it's something, I've seen it for me, it's something as simple as the lettering. So I as a writer, the lettering is very, very important to me. The lettering is the delivery system for my story. And I have seen stories where I don't like the style of the lettering. The letterer is not like quite up to snuff. And you don't realize it as a reader reading the story. Most people don't even pay attention to the lettering. But if the lettering doesn't work, the story is coming into your brain wrong. You're processing it in a wrong way. And a great letterer actually lifts your story up. And I think that I never thought about this. The letterer is to the writing what the inker is to the penciling in a way. Just the way the wrong inker can take great penciling and kind of drag it down, and a great inker can lift it up. The lettering as a delivery system for my words really has the power to make or break my story. And Rick Parker did such a wonderful job on Kraven. So I am in his debt.
And why do you think people will call this? Like I said, I've read everything I've read. Everyone I've talked to, trumpets this as the greatest Kraven story, and I agree. But it's, do you think maybe Kraven hadn't been written to his full potential before you got your hands on him? I
think that's very possibly it. If I had said, 6 months before I wrote this story, hey, I'm doing a story and I'm killing off Kraven the Hunter. No one would care. You know what I mean? Yeah. And then, the key is to make the reader care. The key is also, at least for me as a writer, I always say to take the character, peel back the top of his head, get out your flashlight and shine a light in there and find corners of this character's psyche that haven't been explored before. So we can really know this character psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, and really, really create a three-dimensional vision of who this person is. And that's what I tried to do with Kraven. So you got people to really care about him and also to see him in a way he hadn't been seen before. And that's always the goal. Sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail. But to try to bring something fresh to these characters, something that hasn't been seen before. And it's hard because, some of these characters have been around for 80 years. But I hope that there's always some little corner of the psyche somewhere where you can find something new to explore. And Kraven hadn't been explored in that much depth, his backstory. So I had a lot of room to play there. And then when you make people care, and then you kill the character off, then it's all of a sudden oh my God, you killed Kraven. Well, you wouldn't have cared 6 months ago, but you care now, don't you? And so that was the challenge there. That was the challenge.
And correct me if I'm wrong. Was this the first storyline that ran through all the Spider-Man books? Because there was 3 books at this point.
Yes, and that's another element that I think made the story memorable. Jim Salicrup had taken over by that point as the editor on the Spider-Man books, and Jim was the one that said, we can't have 6 issues of this in Spectacular Spider-Man and have Spider-Man fighting Dr. Octopus over an Amazing Spider-Man, because it'll kill the reality of your story. Mm-hmm. So Jim is the first guy, I think the first guy in comics that ever said, hey, we're going to take one story and run it through both books. And everyone's been doing that ever since. You've seen that over and over again ever since then, where even if a character has 3 books, one story will run through all the books. But no one had ever done that before Salicrup did. And that was another element that I think that really added to the impact of that story, because that was the only Spider-Man story you were going to get. And there were 3 books. So for an entire month, we ran through all three Spider-Man books. And then for another entire month, all 3 Spider-Man books. And I think the other thing that was in our favor too is this is pre-internet age, mm-hmm. So for a lot of people, so there were fanzines out there, and if you went to your local comic shop, maybe you saw a little poster or something. But most people just bought their comic books and went home and read them. They weren't getting any inside information. Yeah. So a lot of people read that story and got to the end of the first issue. And it's like, what the hell just happened? They just killed Spider-Man, if it was done now, I'd be on CNN and it'd be the death of Spider-Man, and then they would ask me to please, could we extend this story to 18 issues or something? Yeah. But it was, it was really compact. It went out there. I think it surprised people, and so that there was still that element of freshness and newness and surprise. Everybody seems to know everything about everything these days before something even comes out. With movies, before you get the trailer, you get the trailer for the trailer, which is really a weird one. Big news on the internet tomorrow. They're releasing the trailer for the new movie. You'll find every bit of information about this story or that movie or that TV show, and it was a simpler time. So people were really surprised by that story. They didn't really know what was coming.
And I think the momentum helped it too, because 3 books a month, that was almost a weekly story.
Yeah, it's true. But and to totally contradict myself, what I take great pleasure in and great gratitude is, to this day, I have people come up to me at conventions and they're like, I just read this last week, and they're reading it now with the same kind of fresh eyes that people had years ago. And even with all the information out there in the world and the internet and everything, people are still reading and appreciating it. And I think that's the thing that Mike and I and Bob and the whole team, what we really, really has been so gratifying all these years later, is the fact that, they keep reprinting it, new readers keep finding it. And that's what you hope for any story, that it has a life, that it lives on. Believe me, especially the way comics were then. There was not a thought in our mind for a second that we'd be talking about this story 30 years later. Never in a million years would we think we'd be talking about it.
It's timeless. It ages well. It's, people are always mentioning, what are some great Spider-Man stories? And this is always on the list.
Well, yeah. And I'm very, very, very appreciative. I don't take it for granted. It's mm-hmm. a really It's a really great thing, and I am very, very grateful. Plus, it's nice that they keep reprinting it because they keep paying us.
That is nice too.
The next thing we need is the movie, right? We need a movie.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing I was going to ask you. There's been talks about them adapting this for a movie, right?
Talk about it, but who knows? I know as much as you do.
Mm-hmm.
I know what I read online. And I'd be curious to see. I think it would be a great thing. And I've said this many times before, but I've written a lot of these DC animated movies. I think Kraven would make a great animated movie. Because I always think the problem is you've got, they pay these lead actors, he's getting $20 million a movie and he's going to spend a third of the movie buried alive, right? I don't know how happy he's going to be about that. But if we do it animated, so it's okay. They're not going to care that much, But I would love to see the story on the screen. Now, right now, the Spider-Man they have now is supposed to be, 16 or 17. So the story's not going to work till he's, 25.
Yeah.
But maybe, maybe they could do one of these standalone things. DC seems to be very happy to do standalone movies that aren't part of a continuing universe, like this new Joker movie,
mm-hmm.
which is basically its own thing. So I would love to see a Kraven movie, and I am available to write it. And anyone wants to give me a call, I'm here.
I don't understand. I mean, I'm sure these studios have like their people, their go-to people and stuff, but I don't understand why they don't go to more comic book writers. Because I'm like, these people wrote the source material. Why aren't you at least consulting with them?
And a lot of us, as I do have a lot of experience writing for TV and for film and all these things. So we're here. We know how to do it. So give me a call, Sony.
At least take a lunch and ask,
Right.
But if you got the call, how would you update Kraven for either the animated or a live action? Because you really can't go with the loincloth or anything. I don't think.
Well, I think you could. I think you could. I mean, because really, if you remember before I specifically, he used to wear those leopard skin pedal pushes before that.
Yeah.
The whole idea is that and especially in that story, his character is stripped down. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's all he is like some crazed animal, and on one level, and that of course is the great dichotomy in his soul. On the one hand, he is this primal creature of the jungle, and the other, he's the son of Russian royalty. So he's got these two parts of his personality, the jungle and quote civilization. And I'll put that in quotes because he's not really that civilized human being. Warring with each other. So I think, you could do it. I think you absolutely could do it. I certainly don't. You don't want to put him in some kind of costume or something. I think that would not work for that character. But in terms of, those are little touches. That's external. That's icing on the cake. I think the essence of the story is the story, and you don't have to change a hell of a lot about that story to make it work on the screen. You really don't.
Okay. Yeah. So you wouldn't change any of the backstory or anything.
No, I don't think so. The only thing I would like to see looking back is, especially you would have time in a movie, is to give a little more life to the people around Kraven. He grew up, obviously he had this connection to the jungle and to Africa and African nations, and so he had these Africans that worked for him and with him, and you never get to learn anything about them, and they can seem kind of like quote, old-fashioned in 1940s jungle props or something,
Mm-hmm.
And so I would love to see those characters deepened and expanded, so you can see really more what his personal relationships were with these people and how it reflected where he was in his life. That's about the only thing I would change. So, a film would, on some levels, you wouldn't be able to go as deep psychologically because we have so much of it as internal narration. At the same time, you can expand things out in different ways to deepen the story in other arenas, So I would like to see that. I would like to see more of what his relationship really is to these people and to those countries where he lived, and that life that he had on the African continent,
Mm-hmm. I was gonna say, if you didn't mind shifting gears a little bit, I know the character didn't start in this story, but where did the idea for Vermin come from?
I don't remember very well. We were doing Captain America, and I think the idea just came to me. I thought, what could be a really, really creepy, disgusting character? Rats and a man rat.
Mm-hmm.
who can telepathically control rats. I mean, I just thought that was, and as Vermin developed, one of the things that his character did is just being in his presence, being around him, brought up all these sort of primal, violent, ugly impulses in everyone around him. So he was a very weird and dangerous character. And during my Spectacular Spider-Man run with Sal Buscema, we really got to explore the character, who he was when he wasn't Vermin, and what traumas in his life created Vermin. Same kind of thing that I did in terms of Kraven. Okay, we've got the man rat, but who is he? Mm-hmm. What made him into this? What's his backstory? What's his family? What's his trauma? And very proud of those stories that Sal and I did. That 2 years on Spectacular Spider-Man is among my favorite work that I've ever done for Marvel or DC in terms of my mainstream superhero work. And I would really, really love for Marvel to finally reprint that stuff. It's been reprinted in Spain and Italy and all over the world, and for some reason it's never been collected here, and it baffles me. But I would love to see it.
You would think if no other issues, they would reprint The Child Within, just because it's like a sequel to Kraven's Last Hunt.
Yes, it is. In fact, it would be kind of cool to see Kraven, Soul of the Hunter, and The Child Within all in one giant volume.
Yes.
That would be cool. That would be very cool. Oh, well, it's not in my, these things are not in my hands. I find out about these collected editions the same way everyone else does. I see the solicits when they announce them, and I go, oh, look, they're reprinting that. Oh, look, they're very rarely, in terms of Marvel and DC, do I ever know in advance that they're reprinting anything of mine. I find out like everyone else. And then eventually I'll get my comps in the mail and put them on the shelf. But no, they never contact me in advance about these things. It's always a surprise. So every month I'm looking to see what they're reprinting next,
Mm. But you did mention the Soul of the Hunter, which was like a one-shot follow-up. So did I read this correctly also, that this was like a response to, I guess, certain people were like, oh, well, you glorified suicide in Kraven's Last Hunt. And
yeah, that's exactly what happened. And I was in Tom DeFalco's office one day, and he had gotten some letter from some suicide prevention group, and they're saying that we had glorified suicide, which is not what that story is about in any way, shape, or form.
No.
In fact, I always point out, we build up this whole idea that Kraven's mother had a mental breakdown. She died in an institution. And there's this recurring motif. They said my mother was insane. And the last words that he thinks before he puts the gun in his mouth, hope we're not giving anything away, they said my mother was insane. Very clearly, he had inherited the same mental illness. He thinks he's having an honorable death, but it's a tragic, horrible death. And so, but it disturbed me profoundly that anyone would think, even for a second, that that's what we were doing. And that sparked the idea for Soul of the Hunter, which was a standalone sequel. Maybe it was more like an afterword or something, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So I was actually very glad that recently Marvel put out a really big edition with Kraven's Last Hunt, Soul of the Hunter, a bunch of other stories that I wrote that tangentially tied in with Kraven's Last Hunt. I think they had the first appearance of Vermin, or maybe there was a Captain America, Marvel team-up, Spider-Man, Captain America, and Vermin that was in there, and a few other stories like that were all in there. So it was really a nice volume. But yeah, so that's what spurred that on, is like, it really, really disturbed me profoundly that people would think that after reading that story. It was not in any way, shape, or form glorifying suicide. He was a sick and tormented individual, and who took a tragic exit from his life.
I mean, he's running around New York in a loincloth. I mean, he wasn't exactly the most balanced person, yeah?
That's true. That's very true.
But I mean, even just
I know when I've run around town in a loincloth, they always come in a cop car and they take me away. So, yeah. So you have to be careful about that stuff.
But we're talking about the visuals on Kraven's Last Hunt also. But like Soul of the Hunter, like we said, the Soul of the Hunter, he's in the red and blue suit, so it's like visually you get the contrast with Kraven's Last Hunt also.
Yes, that's true. I never thought about that. That is true. He's in the classic suit in that one. But the story has a slightly different tone, and it's really more a psychological story, and it's really it's that story, even though it deals with that issue of suicide with Kraven, it's more about Peter, the Soul of the Hunter. It's about his guilt, because Peter Parker, being who he is, once he found out what Kraven had done to himself, the first thought someone like Peter's going to have is, what could I have done to have prevented that? Mm-hmm. So he's tortured tortured by guilt that this happened on his watch. And so one of the questions of Saul the Hunter, it's kind of a Twilight Zone thing, is his encounter with the Kraven from beyond the grave, is it real? Or is it, as Mary Jane suggests at the end of the story, his mind's way of working out not just the trauma of Kraven's suicide, but the trauma of what he went through, being buried alive for 2 weeks, which is going to screw up anybody. So it's really about Peter's psychological healing, along with dealing with this issue of Kraven and his suicide.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up too. Yeah, Soul the Hunter, also deals with Peter's trauma because Mary Jane's, just says, you never want to talk about it. You just,
Yes, exactly. And that, again, that's the kind of thing I like to do, because these things happen in superhero comics all the time,
Yeah.
These crazy things happen to people, and on they go with their lives. It's like, now the news story, and it never gets mentioned. But the poor guy was buried alive for 2 weeks, robbed of his life. His wife was traumatized. That's a horrible thing that happened to him, that Kraven did to him. It's really, really horrible thing. So what kind of impact, is the question I ask myself, does this have on a person? That's probably something he's going to, in some way, shape, or form, Peter is carrying with him for the rest of his life, that was done to him. So and that to me is what for me as a writer, what makes a good story. It's getting in there. You can have whatever's going on the outer level, the pyrotechnics, the superhero, supervillain battles, all that stuff. That's a lot of fun. But it's what's going on inside the characters that's always the most fascinating to me.
And I'm sure you're like, I don't know, but why don't it doesn't seem like they reprint this as often as, Kraven's Last Hunt. They reprint that over and over in so many formats. I never see this reprinted that much.
You're talking about Soul the Hunter?
Soul the Hunter, yes.
I think this edition that came out last year, the most recent edition of Kraven, was a big hardcover that had Soul the Hunter in it. I think that's the first time since it came out that it was reprinted. Yeah. I don't think it's ever been reprinted before.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I have an original copy of it, yeah.
Yeah. So do I, strangely enough.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, you better have an original copy.
I try to have at least one copy of everything I've done, yeah.
But all right, here's a question for you. What is your favorite Spider-Man story that you did not write?
When I came to Spider-Man right at the beginning, I was probably in junior high school, right at the beginning of John Romita Sr.'s run on the book. And that was the 2-part story where Norman Osborn was revealed as the Green Goblin. And I still remember being, 11 years old or something, 11 or 12, and I lived in Brooklyn. I used to buy my comics at what they call a candy store, which is basically, it's a soda fountain, and magazines and some little cheap toys and stuff. And I remember seeing, and I wasn't reading Marvel at the time. I was still like a DC guy, but looking at this cover, and it was the Green Goblin pulling, well, it wasn't Spider-Man, it was Peter Parker, but you could see the Spider-Man costume beneath his shirt. I had never seen a story where it's like the villain pulling the exposed hero, and he's helpless. I was fascinated by that, but it was the next month when I finally went and bought that issue, and the second part of it, and read it, and then I had to go back and find a back issue and read the whole thing. But that story had such an impact on me, and began my love of the character. So it has a special place in my heart, and the whole John Romita run, especially that first year of his run. I think because of the tensions between them, I think if you look at kind of the end of Ditko's run, both Stan and Ditko were feeling a little frustrated, and the stories weren't what they had been for all those incredible stories they had done for whatever it was 3 years before that. And then I felt like when Ditko left, it was like Stan was like liberated in some way, and you can see Stan's writing is really exciting, and Romita's art was so dramatic and so powerful, and I felt so lucky that years later I actually got to work on a story with John Romita Sr. because he was, one of my artistic heroes. And one of those people that, like Sal Buscema, who's not just a great artist, so important to Marvel, but what a nice human being, and what a pleasure it was to work with him. And when I worked with him, it was a story, I forget what it was called, but it was Peter looking back on the last night he spent with Gwen Stacy. It was in Web Spinners #1. It was a little 10-page backup. And here's Romita Sr. after being in the business for, since the 1950s, and this is like the late 1990s. and he's still working these stories. And I talked to him on the phone and be like, it's not quite right. I got to redo this page. He was still so passionate and so careful, and he did such a beautiful job. And for me, that little 11-year-old kid in my soul, to get to work with John Romita Sr., that was one of the thrills of my career. It was really something.
I mean, just the love of the Green Goblin. I mean, it makes so much sense now because all the great stuff you did with first Harry Osborn and then with Norman Osborn after the Clone Saga.
Yeah. Someone pointed that out to me because I was talking about this Romita story, and they said, "And isn't that great that you got to write the Green Goblin all those years later because you love that story?" And I went, "Oh yeah, I never thought about that." That passion was implanted in me way back then, and then I got to spend 2 years writing these Goblin stories, and then Norman came back and more Green Goblin stories. Yeah, it's true. In a lot of ways, I have to say, I think Harry's a more interesting Green Goblin to me as a writer than Norman is, because of that great dynamic between the two of them.
Yes.
Because they're best friends, because even when they're like at each other's throats, they still love each other. Do you know? So here's two guys like, pounding the crap out of each other, and yet, they could never take it to the finality because they love each other too much. It's a great, great dynamic, to play with that love-hate dynamic. Two best friends who are also the absolute worst enemies. Like, you couldn't ask for anything more dramatically. So that I had a blast writing the Harry Green Goblin.
Oh yeah, I mean that with Harry, it seems more like he's there is some innocent part of him in there. It's more like a mental illness. I mean, with Norman, especially modern Norman, he just seems like pure evil.
Right. The way Stan played him back in the day was he was definitely was dealing with a mental illness, and maybe that's changed over the years, and he's just a rotten person now, But he was a very twisted, and Stan used to do that thing where Norman would get amnesia and be this really sweet guy, then the Green Goblin persona would come back and he'd go crazy again, then he'd get amnesia again, But yes, it's probably my favorite Spider-Man villain, the Goblin. Not probably, without question, my favorite Spider-Man villain. Just don't tell Kraven I said that. Because he'll get pissed.
But yeah, and I love Spider-Man's marriage. I wish they'd bring it back. And I love all the Spider-Man stuff you've done. It's just part of my childhood and growing up. And
well, thank you. Yeah, I love writing the marriage. I love the Peter Mary Jane relationship. It was a great thing, and it was something really unique, I think, in they had Reed and Sue were married all those years, but I always felt that the Peter Mary Jane relationship and marriage had a sort of a depth and a reality that I didn't feel as much in Reed and Sue. And I love the Fantastic Four, don't get me wrong. But there's something about Peter and Mary Jane. I always say that Peter Parker is perhaps the most three-dimensional, psychologically real character in the Marvel DC superhero universes.
Yes.
He's just, as a writer and as a reader, I believe in Peter 100%. He's real to me. And the same thing with Mary Jane and that relationship. They were two very real people to me, and to get to write them, it was more like hanging out with these two people and just getting to know them and understand them. So I loved writing that marriage.
Oh yeah, I mean those characters seem so real, so real to everyone. I think that's why people are so passionate about the characters and even that marriage.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, I think that's everything I had, at least for Kraven's Last Hunt. I'll have to get you back on for something else, because like I said, I'm looking at the list. I'm like, oh yeah, I read this. I love this. Oh yeah, I read this. I love this.
There's a lot of stuff out there. Yeah. So I will remind people about my workshop, November 8th through 10th. So go to my website, jamesdematteis.com, to the workshop section, and please pick up a copy of The Girl in the Bay from Dark Horse Burger Books and Impossible Incorporated from IDW. And any social media you have? Oh, yes. You can always find me on Twitter. I'm probably on Twitter a little too much. And I also have Facebook, which I'm not on as much as Twitter, but it's there, and I do tend to it. And then, of course, my website. So I've really, a lot of people have these very negative experiences on Twitter. I've rarely, if ever, had negative experiences. I find that it's a great way to connect with the people that read and enjoy my work. I'm always happy to talk to people, and it's very sweet and very gratifying. So, yeah, feel free to reach out to me on social media. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for giving me this time. My pleasure. My pleasure. And maybe I'll come back another time. We can talk about the other things you want to ask me.
Oh, it definitely. At some point, I will reach out. Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much.
All
Enjoy
right.
the weekend.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. All right, everyone. The great J.M. DeMatteis. Like I said, I'm going to definitely have to talk to him about his Captain America run, some of his DC stuff. Hey, maybe we'll hit Child Within when Wilf is available. All right, so that's right. That's right. We are the Ultimate Spider-Cast. I almost forgot. I didn't. I get nervous sometimes, especially talking to these legendary figures who wrote like my childhood. So Mr. J.M. DeMatteis shared his social media. Well, all of you should know where to find us by now. But if this is your first time listening, because of course we had Mr. J.M. DeMatteis on, send us your thoughts, because this is the first week of October. We're going to be doing some spooky stories. Next, we're going to be doing some carrying storylines from Spectacular Spider-Man. So email us. Or again, if you're a comic book creator, just like Mr. J.M. DeMatteis, email us, capesandlunatics@gmail.com. You can follow Ultimate Spider-Cast on Facebook, facebook.com/Ultimate Spider-Cast. And we even have a Spider-Man Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/Ultimate Spider-Cast. Follow us on Twitter @ULT Spider-Cast. Mr. DeMatteis' favorite hangout, Twitter @ULT Spider-Cast. Follow CL Sidekicks on Instagram. Check out Work in Progress, capesandlunatics.org. Subscribe to the Capes and Lunatics YouTube channel. You can see this. Well, you'll just see me on the video, but we have this video and many more on our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter that tells you everything that comes out every week. So we have at least 7 shows a week coming out between 2 podcasts. capesandlunatics.home.blog. You can call us on our voicemail. Just pick up your phone, 614-382-2737. That's 614-38-CAPES. And again, I mean, even if you just want to say, hey, great interview, or hey, why didn't you ask him this? Please, we love feedback. And you can watch all of these live. You could have heard me talk to Mr. J.M. DeMatteis live on the Capes and Lunatics Facebook page, our Twitter account, or at getvocal.com/channel/capes. All right, everyone. Like I said, Miss Little Hellfire should be back next time. We'll talk some Carrion and Spectacular Spider-Man. So until then, swing on back. Whip.